The frost clung to the sidewalks of Franklin, Tennessee, on a crisp January morning in 2025, the kind of chill that crept into your bones and stayed there. At 72, James Jim Callahan felt every bit of that cold, his joints creaking like the old oak door of brewed awakening. The small coffee shop he'd made a ritual stop every Monday. His broad shoulders, still squared from decades of military discipline, pushed through the door, the bell above jangling sharply in the quiet hum of the morning rush. The shop smelled of roasted beans and fresh pastries, a haven of warmth against the gray winter outside. Jim, a retired command sergeant major, carried the weight of 35 years in the U.S. Army, scars from Iraq, a bronze star tucked away in a drawer at home, and a quiet pride that didn't need a uniform to shine. His Monday visits weren't just about coffee. They were about the small nod of respect, the 10% veterans discount Brewed Awakening offered. It wasn't much, but with his wife's cancer treatments eating through their savings, every dollar counted. More than that, it was the acknowledgement, a rare moment when someone saw the man beneath the weathered leather jacket and graying hair. Inside, the shop buzzed with its usual crowd. College kids hunched over laptops, young professionals tapping impatiently at their phones, and a few retirees flipping through the morning paper. Jim took his place in line, his hazel eyes scanning the room out of habit, noting exits and faces, a reflex from years in combat zones that never quite faded. His boots tapped lightly on the hardwood floor, patient as always, until he reached the counter. Behind the register stood Kaylee, a 22-year-old with neon mule streaks in her hair and a nose ring that glinted under the fluorescent lights. Her expression screamed boredom, her fingers drumming on the counter as if counting down the seconds to her break. "Morning," Jim said, his voice low and gravelly, tempered by age but steady. "Large black coffee, 1 cream, please." Kaylee barely glanced up, punching the order into the register with a flick of her wrist. "That's $4.25, she said, her tone flat, eyes fixed on the screen. Jim reached into his wallet, pulling out his VA card alongside his debit card. The card was worn, its edges frayed from years of use, but the embossed letters still gleamed. U.S. Army, retired. "Y'all still got the veterans discount on Mondays?" he asked, his Tennessee drawl soft but clear. Kaylee's eyes flicked to the card, then back to Jim. Something in her face tightened, a flash of irritation, sharp and unfiltered. She snorted loud enough for the line behind Jim to hear. "You vets are all the same," she muttered, her voice dripping with disdain, always expecting handouts, discounts, free stuff, a pat on the back just for showing up. The words hit like a slap, slicing through the low murmur of the coffee shop. The air turned heavy, the kind of silence that follows a gunshot. A woman in her 40s clutching a to-go cup froze mid-sip. A guy in a business suit glanced up from his phone, eyebrows raised. 2 college students at a nearby table exchanged awkward looks, their conversation stalling. Jim, however, didn't flinch. His face remained calm, almost unreadable, the kind of composure forged in places far harsher than a suburban coffee shop. Decades of facing down worse, bullets, bombs, the screams of men under his command, had made a cashier's jab feel like a mosquito bite. "No trouble," Jim said evenly, sliding his VA card back into his wallet. "Just cancel the order then." His tone was polite, final, the same steady cadence he'd used to issue orders in the desert. He gave a small nod, the kind he'd offered to colonels and privates alike, and turned toward the door, his boots clicking deliberately on the floor. Kaylee rolled her eyes, muttering whatever under her breath, already turning to the next customer. The line shuffled forward, but the tension lingered. The woman with the to-go cup frowned, her lips parting as if to speak, but she didn't. The businessman shifted uncomfortably, his fingers tightening around his phone. A retiree in a corner booth shook his head, but no one said a word. It was a moment that felt wrong, a small injustice poised to slip away unnoticed, another quiet wound in a world that often overlooked men like Jim. He was 2 steps from the door, the cold outside already seeping through the glass, when a voice cut through the shop. "Hold on, sir." The shout came from the back, where Ethan Harper, the 35-year-old manager, had been half listening from his office, a cramped space cluttered with inventory sheets and a flickering computer. He'd been on a call with a supplier, juggling numbers for the week's order, when he caught sight of the older man turning to leave. Something about the man's posture, ramrod straight, deliberate, unmistakable, stopped Ethan cold. He dropped the phone mid-sentence, the headset clattering onto the desk, and bolted out of the office, his sneakers squeaking on the polished floor. "Mr. Callahan!" Ethan called again, his voice urgent, almost reverent. Jim paused, one hand on the door, his weathered face creasing with confusion as he turned. Ethan's eyes locked onto him, and in that instant, recognition hit like a thunderbolt. Ethan straightened, his shoulders squaring instinctively as if he were back at Fort Campbell in 2010, a scared 20-year-old recruit under Jim's command. Without hesitation, he snapped to attention, right hand rising in a crisp salute that silenced the entire shop. "Command Sergeant Major Callahan, sir." Ethan's voice rang out, carrying the weight of a soldier addressing a legend. "Permission to shake your hand, sir." The coffee shop went still. Kaylee, mid-pour, froze, the coffee pot trembling in her hand. Customers turned, some standing, others craning their necks. The businessman set his phone down. The woman with the to-go cup gripped it tighter, her eyes wide. Jim's expression softened, a flicker of surprise breaking through his calm. He studied Ethan for a long moment, the gears turning behind his hazel eyes. "Harper?" Jim said finally, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Fort Campbell, Supply Battalion, 9 or 10, wasn't it?" "Yes, sir," Ethan replied, still holding the salute, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved my hide back then, kept me from washing out when I thought I couldn't cut it." He lowered his hand only when Jim stepped forward, offering a handshake. Ethan gripped it with both hands, his respect radiating across the stunned room. "It's an honor, sir, a damn honor." Kaylee's face flushed, her earlier confidence crumbling. She glanced from Ethan to Jim, her mouth slightly open, as if realizing she'd just stepped into something far bigger than herself. The shop's silence held a weight, a collective holding of breath, as if everyone sensed the moment was more than it seemed, a collision of past and present, of sacrifice and ignorance, of a legacy that refused to be ignored. The silence and brewed awakening hung like a held breath, the kind that comes before a storm breaks. James Jim Callahan stood at the center of the coffee shop, his weathered hands still clasped in Ethan Harper's fervent handshake, his hazel eyes steady but carrying a depth that seemed to pull the room toward him. The air was thick with unspoken stories, the weight of a life lived in service pressing against the mundane hum of a Tennessee morning. Ethan, the manager, still gripped Jim's hand, his voice trembling with a reverence that made the fluorescent lights seem dimmer, the world smaller. "Command Sergeant Major Callahan," Ethan said, his voice cracking as he turned to face the stunned customers. "This man didn't just serve. He defined service." He paused, swallowing hard, his eyes glistening as he looked back at Jim. Fallujah, 2004, an ambush that should have wiped out his entire platoon. Insurgents hit from 3 sides, RPGs, small arms, chaos. Jim carried 2 wounded men to safety under fire, went back for a third, and held the line until evac arrived. Bronze Star with valor. Never spoke a word about it afterward. Ethan's words landed like stones in a still pond, rippling through the coffee shop. Kaylee, the cashier with neon moo hair, stood frozen behind the counter, her earlier scorn replaced by a dawning horror. Her hands shook as she set down the coffee pot, its clink against the counter the only sound in the room. Customers shifted, some leaning forward, others wiping their eyes. A woman in her 50s, clutching a scarf, let out a soft gasp. A college kid with earbuds dangling forgot his laptop screen, his mouth slightly open. Ethan wasn't done. His voice grew steadier, louder, as if he needed the world to hear, and that wasn't the end. Jim trained thousands of us at Fort Campbell, kids like me who showed up cocky or scared or both, thinking we knew what tough was. He taught us discipline, not with yelling, but with being. He'd stay up all night rewriting training manuals, then run 10 miles with us at dawn. When I twisted my knee in a night exercise, ready to quit, he slung me over his shoulder and carried me 2 miles to the finish. Told me, son, the only failure is giving up. You're stronger than you know. Ethan's voice broke and he wiped his sleeve across his eyes. That's who this man is. Jim stood motionless, his face a mask of quiet dignity, neither seeking nor shying from the attention. The scars of his service, some visible in the faint lines across his knuckles, others buried deep in memories of sand and blood, seemed to pulse in the silence. He didn't speak. Didn't need to. His presence was enough, a living testament to sacrifices most in the room could barely imagine. Kaylee's face crumpled, her earlier bravado evaporating like mist in the sun. She stepped from behind the counter, her sneakers squeaking, her eyes red. I, I didn't know, she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. I'm so sorry, Mr. Callahan. I just... She trailed off, her hands twisting together, the neon streaks in her hair now seeming out of place, childish against the weight of her mistake. Jim looked at her, his gaze steady but not harsh. It's all right, miss, he said softly, his Tennessee drawl carrying a warmth that cut through her shame. You didn't know. Most don't. His words were simple, but they carried the authority of a man who'd seen enough to forgive ignorance without excusing it. The room stirred. A man in his 60s, wearing a faded Vietnam veteran cap, stood slowly from a corner booth, his hands trembling as he removed his hat. He didn't speak, just raised a gnarled hand in a salute, his eyes locked on Jim's. The gesture was a bridge across decades, from one war to another, a silent acknowledgement of shared burdens. Jim returned the salute, a crisp motion that seemed to pull the air taut. Then, from the back of the line, a woman in a business suit, her briefcase still slung over her shoulder, stepped forward. Her heels clicked sharply as she approached the counter. I'd like to cover the next 10 veterans who come in here, she said, her voice firm but shaking with emotion. She pulled out a credit card and slid it across the counter. In honor of Mr. Callahan, for what he's done, for all of them. Her eyes flicked to the Vietnam vet, then back to Jim, and she blinked rapidly, fighting tears. A murmur of agreement rippled through the shop. A young father, holding a toddler on his hip, spoke up. Make it 15. I'll chip in. His voice cracked and he looked at Jim. My brother's in the Marines, deployed right now. Thank you, sir. The toddler squirmed, oblivious, but the man's eyes shone with gratitude and something deeper. Pride, mixed with fear for a loved one far away. One by one, others joined in. A college student, barely 19, dug into his backpack and pulled out a crumpled 20. It's all I got, but it's for the next vet, he said, his voice earnest. An elderly woman, her hands curled around a cane, hobbled forward and placed a $5 bill on the counter. My husband was at Normandy, she whispered. He'd want this. The collective gesture built like a wave, each act of respect crashing against the earlier disrespect, washing it away. Kaylee, still standing awkwardly by the counter, wiped her eyes, her breaths hitching. She looked at Jim, then at Ethan, and finally found her voice. Mr. Callahan, can I make you a fresh coffee, please? I want to do it right. Her sincerity was raw, almost desperate, as if she could pour her regret into the act. Jim nodded, a small gesture that seemed to lift a weight from her shoulders. Large black, 1 cream, he said, his tone gentle but firm. And don't worry, miss. Mistakes are how we learn. As Kaylee hurried to prepare the coffee, her hands steadier now, the shop's atmosphere shifted. Customers began to approach Jim, not crowding him, but drawn to him like moths to a flame. A woman in her 30s, her eyes red, mentioned her father, a Gulf War vet who never talked about his service. He's like you, she said, her voice trembling, quiet but strong. A man in a flannel shirt, his work boots caked with mud, shared that his son was training at Paris Island. I hope he meets someone like you, sir, he said, his throat tight. The Vietnam vet approached last, his steps slow but deliberate. Kay-san, 68, he said simply, extending a hand. Jim shook it, their grip lingering. 2 men bound by battles fought decades apart. You carried the torch, brother, the older man said, his voice rough with emotion. Still carrying it. Jim's composure wavered for the first time, a flicker of something raw crossing his face. He nodded, unable to speak. the weight of the moment settling into his bones heavier than the morning's cold. Ethan watched from the counter, his own eyes misty. He leaned toward Kaylee, who was carefully pouring Jim's coffee. "That's why we followed him," he whispered. "He never asked for glory, never needed it. He just was." When Kaylee handed Jim his coffee, the cup was steaming, perfect, a small act of redemption. "No charge, sir," she said, her voice steady now. "Never again." Jim accepted the cup, his fingers brushing the worn edge of his VA card still in his pocket. He didn't speak, but his eyes met hers, and in that moment she understood. Respect wasn't about knowing a name or a rank. It was about seeing the person, the sacrifices woven into their silence. The shop erupted in spontaneous applause, a wave of sound that rolled from the back tables to the front. Customers stood, some saluting, others wiping tears. The woman with the scarf pressed it to her face, sobbing quietly. The young father hugged his toddler tighter, his eyes never leaving Jim. The Vietnam vet remained standing, his salute unwavering, a sentinel of memory. Jim took it all in with the same quiet dignity that had carried him through fire and loss. He raised his coffee cup slightly, a gesture not of triumph, but of acknowledgement, for the soldiers he'd led, the ones he'd lost, the ones still fighting. The applause grew louder, a chorus of gratitude that seemed to shake the walls, as if the shop itself was saluting a man who'd given everything and asked for nothing. As Jim turned toward a table by the window, Ethan followed, his voice low. "Sir, I'm sorry about earlier. That's not who we are here." Jim shook his head, a faint smile breaking through. "Kids learn, Ethan. Sometimes it takes a spark to light the fire." But the fire was lit now, burning bright in the hearts of everyone who'd witnessed it, a flame of respect, kindled by a man whose quiet valor had turned a cold morning into a moment of reckoning. The winter sun climbed higher over Franklin, Tennessee, casting a pale glow through the fogged-up windows of Brood Awakening. Inside, the coffee shop hummed with a new energy, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the weight of what had transpired. James Jim Callahan sat by the window, his large black coffee with one cream cooling in his hands, his hazel eyes tracing the frost patterns on the glass. The applause had faded, but the air still crackled with something unspoken. A shift, a spark, a quiet revolution kindled by a man who'd never sought to start one. Ethan Harper, the manager, stood behind the counter, his gaze flicking to Jim every few moments as if to anchor himself in the presence of a legend. Kaylee, the young cashier with neon blue hair, moved with a newfound purpose, her hands steady as she poured coffee for the next customer. Her earlier arrogance was gone, replaced by a raw, almost fragile sincerity. She'd apologized to Jim, made his coffee with care, but the weight of her mistake lingered in her chest, a bruise she wasn't ready to ignore. Ethan leaned toward her, his voice low but firm. "Kaylee, what happened today? It's not just about one moment. It's about what you do next." He nodded toward Jim, who was quietly sipping his coffee, his leather jacket creased from years of wear. "That man's been changing lives for decades without saying a word. You get to decide what you take from this." Kaylee nodded, her eyes red but resolute. She didn't speak, but something had shifted inside her, a seed planted in the fertile ground of regret. She glanced at Jim, then at the customers still watching him with quiet awe. The Vietnam veteran in the corner booth had returned to his seat, his cap now clutched in his hands like a relic. The businesswoman who'd offered to pay for 10 veterans' coffees was typing furiously on her phone, her face streaked with mascara. The young father, his toddler now asleep on his shoulder, stared at Jim as if memorizing him, a beacon for the brother he prayed would come home safe. The shop's door jingled, and a new customer stepped in, a man in his 40s wearing a faded Army Ranger cap, his eyes tired but sharp. He hesitated at the threshold, scanning the room, then made his way to the counter. Kaylee straightened, her voice softer than before. "Welcome to Brood Awakening. What can I get you?" "Black coffee, medium," the man said, his voice rough like he hadn't spoken all morning. He reached for his wallet, but Kaylee stopped him, her hand raised. "Sir, if you're a veteran, it's on the house today," she said, her words tentative but genuine. "In honor of..." Someone special? She glanced at Jim, who didn't look up but seemed to sense the moment, his fingers tightening slightly around his cup. The ranger's eyes narrowed, then softened. "That's so," he said, following her gaze to Jim. "Who's he?" Ethan stepped forward, his voice steady but charged. "That's Command Sergeant Major James Callahan. Saved his platoon in Fallujah, trained half the soldiers at Fort Campbell, including me. He's the reason we're starting something new here." He paused, his throat tight. "From now on, Mondays are Callahan Day. Free coffee for every veteran, no questions asked." The ranger's face shifted, a flicker of recognition passing through his eyes. He nodded slowly, then turned to Jim, raising his coffee cup in a silent toast. Jim returned the gesture, a small nod that carried the weight of 1,000 shared battles. The moment was quiet but electric, a thread weaving through the room, connecting strangers in a way no one could have predicted. Kaylee watched, her breath catching. She turned to Ethan, her voice barely audible. "I want to do more. I messed up bad today. I need to make it right." Her eyes burned with a determination that hadn't been there an hour ago. Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder. "Then do it. Learn. Grow. Make it mean something." He handed her a flyer from under the counter, one he'd been drafting in his office. It announced Callahan Day, with a small note at the bottom, "In honor of Command Sergeant Major James Callahan, whose service reminds us all to listen, respect, and remember." Kaylee took the flyer, her fingers tracing the words. She looked at Jim, then at the growing crowd of customers, some still lingering, reluctant to let the moment pass. "I'm signing up for a class," she said suddenly, her voice stronger now. "At the community college? They've got one on veteran support services. I want to understand what I didn't see before." Ethan smiled, a rare softness in his eyes. "Good. That's a start, Kaylee. That's how you honor men like him." Across town, word of the morning's events began to spread. The businesswoman posted about it on social media, her tweet going viral within hours. "Met a hero today at Brood Awakening. Command Sergeant Major Callahan, a man who saved lives and asked for nothing. Let's honor our veterans always." The post racked up thousands of likes, retweets, and comments, with people sharing their own stories of veterans who'd touched their lives. By noon, 2 other coffee shops in Franklin had pledged to start their own veteran discount programs, one even calling to ask Ethan for advice. Back at Brood Awakening, the day wore on, but Jim remained, his presence a quiet anchor. He didn't seek the attention, didn't bask in it, but he didn't shy away either. When a young woman approached, her voice trembling as she mentioned her deployed husband, Jim listened, his eyes steady, his questions gentle. When an older man, a Korean War vet, shared a story of loss from 1952, Jim nodded, his silence a balm. Each interaction was a thread, weaving a tapestry of respect that stretched beyond the shop's walls. By the following Monday, Brood Awakening had changed. A small brass plaque appeared on Jim's regular table by the window, engraved simply, "Reserved for those who served, in honor of CSM James Callahan." Ethan had installed it himself, before dawn, without asking permission. He knew Jim would have refused the recognition, but he also knew it wasn't just for Jim, it was for every veteran who'd ever felt unseen. Kaylee, too, had changed. The neon blue hair remained, but her demeanor was different, attentive, deliberate. She'd enrolled in the community college course, spending her evenings reading about PTSD, VA benefits, and the invisible scars of service. She started volunteering at the local VA, bringing coffee from Brood Awakening to outreach events, her smile brightening when a veteran thanked her. The first time she correctly identified a unit patch on a vet's jacket, her pride was palpable, a quiet victory over her past ignorance. Jim, as always, remained unchanged, steady, humble, a man who carried his legacy not in medals but in moments. He arrived every Monday at 9:15 a.m., ordering his large black coffee with 1 cream. Despite Ethan's protests, he paid full price, leaving a tip that matched the discount he refused. "For the next vet who needs it more," he'd say, his voice low but firm. The gesture was small, but it rippled outward, inspiring others to pay it forward. The shop became a haven for veterans, drawn not just by the free coffee, but by the atmosphere of respect. Young soldiers fresh from basic training sat with Vietnam vets, swapping stories over steaming cups. College students listened, absorbing lessons no textbook could teach. The community grew tighter, bound by a shared understanding that some debts could never be repaid, only honored. But the story didn't end there. One Monday, as Jim sat by the window, a young man in a wheelchair rolled into the shop, his face gaunt, his eyes haunted. He wore a ball cap with a Marine Corps insignia, and his hands trembled as he ordered. Kaylee served him with care, her voice soft, her eyes meeting his without flinching. Ethan watched, his heart heavy, knowing the look of a man fresh from war's shadow. The young Marine glanced at Jim, then at the plaque on his table. He wheeled over, hesitating, then spoke. "Sir, they say you're a hero. I don't know if I can do this. Coming back, it's harder than over there." His voice broke and the shop fell quiet again. Every eye on the two men, one a legend, the other searching for a lifeline. Jim leaned forward, his gaze steady, his voice low but clear. "Son, the hardest battles are the ones you fight when the guns go quiet. You're here. That's the first step. You don't walk it alone." He slid his coffee across the table, a silent invitation. The Marine's eyes welled up, and he nodded, a spark of hope flickering in the darkness. As the door jingled behind another customer, the question hung in the air. What would this moment spark? A new beginning for the young Marine? A deeper change in Franklin's heart? Or something bigger? Something that would carry Jim's quiet legacy beyond the shop, beyond Tennessee, into a world desperate for heroes who led not with noise but with heart.